It is past 4 in the morning inside a converted Hollywood church, and the biggest names in music have gone silent. Stevie Wonder has just asked 45 of the most famous singers on earth to sing a line in Swahili, a language almost none of them speak. Across the room, a lean man in a cowboy hat sets down his coffee, pushes back his chair, and starts walking toward the exit. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes. Before the sun rises, one of the most celebrated recording sessions in history is about to nearly fall apart, and the blind genius who wrote "Isn't She Lovely" is the reason why. To understand how it got to that moment, you have to go back a few weeks earlier, to the winter of 1984, when television screens across America and Britain filled with images no one could look away from. Famine was tearing through Ethiopia. Children with hollow cheeks and swollen bellies stared into camera lenses while their mothers stood helpless beside them, too weak to wave the flies away. In London, Bob Geldof and Midge Ure had already answered with a song called "Do They Know It's Christmas?" and it lit a fire under American musicians watching from across the ocean, ashamed that Britain had moved first. Harry Belafonte, the elder statesman of conscience in American entertainment, picked up the phone late one night and started calling people he trusted. Within days, the idea had a name, a producer, and 2 young songwriters who barely believed what they had just agreed to attempt. Quincy Jones was the first call that mattered. He had produced Michael Jackson's biggest records. He understood ego better than anyone in the business, and he agreed almost instantly before he even knew how he would pull it off. Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie shut themselves away for weeks after that, trading melodies late into the night at Michael's house on Havenhurst, chasing something simple enough for amateurs to sing on the spot and powerful enough to make seasoned professionals weep in a vocal booth. Quincy taped a single handwritten sign to the studio door before anyone arrived that night. It read, "Check your ego at the door." He knew exactly what he was inviting into that building, and he knew exactly what could go wrong when you put 46 of the most celebrated voices in the world into one room and told them to share. Stevie Wonder was one of the very first names on Quincy's list, and not just because of his voice. For nearly a decade, Stevie had been something rarer than a hitmaker. He had lobbied Congress in person year after year, pushing for Martin Luther King's birthday to become a national holiday, a fight he finally won in 1983 after writing the song "Happy Birthday" specifically as a weapon in that campaign. He had turned his own blindness, the very thing people once assumed would limit him, into a kind of moral clarity other artists respected without fully being able to explain. When Stevie Wonder said a cause mattered, people in that industry listened, because he had already proven he would spend years, not just one night, proving it. The date Quincy chose was no accident. January the 28th, 1985, the night of the American Music Awards, when nearly every major star in the industry would already be in Los Angeles, dressed up, wide awake, and impossible to say no to in person. Quincy's plan was ruthless in its simplicity. Get them while they are still in town. Get them while the cameras are still rolling on their goodwill. The moment the awards show ended, black cars and vans began pulling away from the Shrine Auditorium, not toward hotel bars and after-parties, but toward a modest recording studio on Brea Avenue that had once, decades earlier, belonged to Charlie Chaplin himself. Inside A&M Studios, folding chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle, name cards taped to music stands like place settings at the strangest dinner party in music history. Diana Ross arrived, still glittering from the award stage, her gown swapped quietly for something simpler once she saw the room. Bruce Springsteen walked in alone, having driven himself straight from the ceremony in his own car, still wearing his stage clothes, hair damp from the California night air. Cyndi Lauper's jewelry jangled every time she moved, a sound the engineers would later have to edit out of the master tape by hand, track by track. Ray Charles settled at the piano like he had been sitting there his whole life. Billy Joel, Tina Turner, Willie Nelson, Kenny Rogers, Dionne Warwick, Paul Simon, Huey Lewis, Al Jarreau, all filing past that handwritten sign on the door, some laughing at it, some reading it twice. 46 voices, 46 egos, all being asked to become one single choir before the night was through. Stevie Wonder arrived quietly, led in by an assistant, and found his place near the piano by touch and memory, the way he had learned to navigate every stage and studio of his life since he was a child prodigy at Motown. For those who had worked with him for years, there was something different about his energy that night, something more urgent than his usual warmth. This was not just another session for him. He had spent much of his career insisting that his blindness sharpened rather than limited his sense of the world, and that same instinct told him something about this song before anyone else in the room had said it aloud. He had never stopped thinking about Africa, not as a distant continent of suffering to be pitied from a comfortable distance, but as a place with its own voice, its own dignity, its own languages that deserve to be heard rather than simply spoken over by well-meaning strangers. As the night wore on, Quincy Jones worked the room like a general and a therapist at once, assigning solo lines, coaxing harmonies, gently steering exhausted stars away from the coffee table when they lingered too long. Lionel Richie, still riding the adrenaline of hosting the awards show just hours earlier, moved between the vocal booth and the control room, half songwriter, half diplomat, translating Quincy's instructions into words nervous singers could actually use. The chorus came together first, that rolling, unmistakable melody everyone in the room already knew by heart, before they had ever opened their mouths to sing it for the tape. Solos were tracked one by one, each artist stepping to the same microphone that Michael Jackson himself had used only minutes before. Bob Dylan, famously uneasy performing for other performers, struggled to find his own voice inside a chorus that size, until Stevie, in an act of quiet generosity nobody had asked of him, sat down at the piano and sang Dylan's line back to him in a Dylan impression so uncannily accurate that the whole room dissolved into laughter, breaking the tension just enough to keep everyone moving forward through the fatigue. But somewhere past 3 in the morning, with dozens of vocal takes already banked onto tape and the finish line finally in sight, Stevie raised his hand and asked, politely, for the room's attention. He had an idea for the bridge, he said, something that had been sitting in his chest since he first heard the demo weeks earlier. Instead of another verse sung entirely in English, why not let part of the song speak in Swahili, one of the most widely spoken languages across the very continent this record existed to help? It made sense to him on every level a songwriter could measure. The song was called "We Are the World." If it truly meant that, shouldn't part of the world it claimed to speak for get to hear itself represented in its own words, rather than only written about from the outside? For a moment, a few voices in the room murmured agreement, and someone near the back even began humming, trying out the shape of the idea. It was a beautiful thought, generous and pointed all at once. Exactly the kind of gesture this song was supposed to be built on. Then Waylon Jennings, the country outlaw who had spent 2 decades building an entire career on refusing to be told what to sing or how to sing it, slowly stood up from his folding chair. He was tired. Everyone in that room was tired, running on adrenaline and vending machine coffee since before sundown. And he was not, he said, going to stand in that room at 4 in the morning and sing words he did not understand in a language he had never once spoken in his life, for a song that was already, in his own estimation, plenty powerful exactly as it was written, in English. Witnesses in the room remember him saying, flatly and without much heat in his voice, that no good old boy sings in Swahili. And with that, he set his headphones down on the chair behind him and started walking toward the door. The room froze. This was not a minor disagreement between 2 songwriters hashing things out in a private room. This was 46 of the most famous people alive watching 2 of their peers nearly come to a standstill over the soul of a song that had already cost weeks of sleepless work, and that was being built, quite literally, to save lives on the other side of the planet. A few other country artists near Waylon shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at each other, unsure whether they agreed more with Stevie's ideal or Waylon's exhaustion, unsure whether they too should stand and follow him toward the exit. Quincy Jones, watching from behind the control booth glass, felt the entire session tremble on the edge of collapse in a way it never had all night. Hours of goodwill, weeks of planning, and the fragile trust of 46 strangers who barely knew each other could unravel in the next 30 seconds if nobody said the right thing. It was Stevie himself, in the end, who diffused what he had started. He had never intended a fight, only an offering. He raised both hands, calm and unhurried, the way he always was even in the eye of a storm, and told the room, gently, that he did not want the song broken over one bridge of lyrics. He would let it go. It was not, he said, worth losing a single person from this room over a handful of words, no matter how much he believed in them. Waylon paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame. Some who were there that night remember him softening for just a moment, nodding once before stepping back inside. Others remember him walking out anyway, choosing not to return to the vocal booth even after the argument had cooled, his part in the final chorus quietly left unfinished. Either way, the crisis that could have splintered the entire session dissolved almost as quickly as it had ignited, and somewhere behind the glass, the tape kept rolling. Quincy Jones stepped out from the control room and reminded everyone, gently but firmly, exactly why they had all skipped their own award show after-parties to stand shoulder to shoulder in a room that smelled of stale coffee and cold pizza boxes stacked by the door. Somewhere on the other side of the world, he said, children were dying of hunger while they stood there debating a single lyric. That reminder, more than any apology from anyone, was what pulled the room back together. Diana Ross reportedly began to cry near the end of the session, not from exhaustion, but from something closer to awe at what a room full of strangers had actually built together by sunrise. Stevie Wonder, for his part, showed no bitterness at all. He had made his case for a continent's voice, been overruled by fatigue and stubbornness, and chosen unity over vindication without a trace of resentment in his face or his singing for the rest of the night. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the studio windows, the song was finished. 10 hours after the first car had pulled up outside A&M Studios, exhausted stars embraced each other, exchanged phone numbers scrawled on scraps of paper and napkins, and stumbled out into a Los Angeles morning that looked entirely ordinary to everyone who had not been inside that room. We Are the World was released 6 weeks later, on March the 7th, 1985. It became the fastest-selling American pop single in history up to that point, and the fund it created eventually raised more than $60 million for famine relief across Africa, feeding and sheltering people an ocean away from that studio on Brea Avenue who would never know any of their names. Stevie Wonder never spoke publicly with anger about that night, not once in the decades since. In interviews afterward, he framed the entire episode simply as the price of caring passionately about something larger than a chorus line. A small bruise worth carrying for a cause worth far more than his pride. He would go on, within just a few years, to write and perform songs demanding the release of Nelson Mandela from a South African prison, once again insisting that Africa's voice belonged inside the music written about it, not merely behind it or beneath it. The Swahili bridge he wanted for We Are the World was never recorded that night. And for decades, the story of why lived only in the memories of the people who had been in that room, whispered at reunions, and passed down in interviews few fans ever saw. It took nearly 40 years for the wider world to hear the full story, when a documentary revisiting that single night finally let surviving witnesses describe, in their own words, exactly how close the whole session had come to falling apart over one man's insistence that a suffering continent deserved to be heard in its own language. For longtime fans of Stevie Wonder, the story lands differently than it does for casual listeners. It is not really a story about a recording session at all. It is one more chapter in a lifelong pattern. A blind man from Saginaw who spent his entire career refusing to let anyone else's comfort decide whose voice got to be heard, whether that meant a national holiday, a jailed South African leader, or 30 seconds of Swahili inside the most famous charity song ever recorded. What almost broke apart in a Hollywood studio at 4 in the morning became, instead, one of the most quietly telling moments in Stevie Wonder's long fight to make sure the people the world tried hardest to forget were never, ever silent.